Somewhere at the bottom of the Black Sea, hidden beneath layers of mud and silt that have settled quietly for thousands of years, there may be the remains of an ancient shoreline, a beach that people once walked along, fished from, and built their homes near, before the sea itself rose up and swallowed it whole, leaving behind only the faintest of traces for modern researchers to painstakingly piece back together. This isn't a myth pulled from ancient legend. It's a real, seriously debated scientific idea, and it connects, in a genuinely fascinating way, to one of the oldest stories ever written down by human hands. A flood story recorded by the ancient Sumerians thousands of years before anyone wrote the more famous version of that same story down in the Bible. Before we go any further, I want to be completely honest and clear about something, because it's easy for a topic like this to drift from careful science into wishful thinking if we're not careful, especially with a story this emotionally compelling and this widely discussed online. There is no confirmed genetic study that directly proves the Sumerians themselves descended from people fleeing a specific flood in the Black Sea. That precise connection remains speculation, an intriguing possibility some researchers have raised rather than a proven scientific fact. What is real and genuinely well documented is the geological evidence for a catastrophic flooding event in the Black Sea region thousands of years ago, alongside a growing body of ancient DNA research tracing how early farming populations moved and spread across this same general region during roughly the same period of history. Together, these two threads of evidence create a compelling picture, even if the specific dots connecting them to the Sumerians by name haven't been fully confirmed yet. It may never be fully confirmed, given how much time has passed and how little direct evidence tends to survive from this particular period and place. Let's walk through this carefully, one piece at a time, because each part of this story is worth understanding clearly on its own, before we try to fit them all together into any kind of larger conclusion. The story begins with the Black Sea itself, and something quite remarkable about its ancient history. Today, the Black Sea is connected to the wider Mediterranean Sea through a narrow winding strait called the Bosphorus, the same waterway that runs directly through the modern city of Istanbul, a bustling ancient crossroads between two continents that most of us have heard of, even if we've never given much thought to its underlying geology. But researchers studying the geological history of this region have found strong evidence that this wasn't always the case. Thousands of years ago, before the last ice age fully ended, the Black Sea appears to have been a separate body of water entirely, a large freshwater lake, sitting at a lower water level than the Mediterranean Sea beside it, cut off from the wider ocean by dry land where the Bosphorus Strait is today. As the last ice age came to an end and global sea levels rose considerably, driven by melting glaciers around the world, the Mediterranean Sea gradually rose higher and higher. According to a hypothesis put forward by two geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, back in the 1990s, there eventually came a moment when the rising Mediterranean broke through the natural barrier, separating it from the lower freshwater lake sitting behind it, flooding into that basin catastrophically. Ryan and Pittman's research suggested this flooding may have happened remarkably quickly, in geological terms, filling the ancient lake basin at a pace considerably faster than a gentle, gradual rise, expanding the water dramatically and pushing the shoreline outward across what had previously been dry, inhabited land. It's worth understanding briefly how geologists actually gathered the evidence behind this idea, since it helps explain why the hypothesis has been taken seriously by serious scientists, even while remaining debated. Researchers studying the floor of the Black Sea have found what appear to be ancient shorelines, sitting well below the current sea level, along with the remains of freshwater mollusk shells in deeper layers of sediment, and saltwater mollusk shells in the layers above them. This kind of shift from freshwater life to saltwater life, sitting in layers stacked directly on top of each other, is exactly the kind of physical evidence you'd expect to find if a freshwater lake had indeed been suddenly overtaken by incoming saltwater from the Mediterranean. Researchers have also used sonar equipment to map old drowned river channels and beach terraces on the seafloor, further supporting the idea that this area was once dry land, sitting well above where the water line used to be. If you find it fascinating that an entire body of water, one many of us have simply always assumed looked the way it does today, may have transformed so dramatically within human memory, that's exactly the kind of quiet, dramatic change this story is built around. Before we continue, if you're enjoying learning about these hidden turning points in ancient history, please consider hitting that like button. It helps this channel keep bringing you stories exactly like this one. It's important to say clearly that this specific hypothesis, often called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, remains genuinely debated among geologists today. Some researchers strongly support Ryan and Pittman's original idea of a sudden, dramatic flood. Others, studying the same general evidence, argue the water level rise happened more slowly and gradually than the original hypothesis proposed, over centuries rather than within a single dramatic event a community might have witnessed directly within just a few generations. This is a genuinely active scientific debate, not a settled fact, and it's worth holding on to that nuance as we continue, rather than treating either version of the story as fully proven. Understanding why researchers disagree about the speed of this flooding is worth a moment of its own, since it's not simply a minor technical squabble. Ryan and Pittman originally calculated that water could have poured through a breach in the natural barrier at the Bosphorus with tremendous force, potentially raising water levels in the Black Sea basin by a noticeable amount every single day, fast enough that people living along the shore might have needed to abandon their homes within a matter of weeks or months, rather than gradually adapting over generations. Other geologists, examining the same general sediment cores and coastal evidence, have argued the rise was more likely gradual, unfolding over centuries rather than weeks, driven by a slower, more general rise in Mediterranean sea levels rather than one single dramatic breach event. Both sides of the debate agree that the water level did rise substantially and that the region was significantly reshaped. What remains genuinely contested is simply how fast that change actually felt to the people living through it, a detail that matters enormously for whether this event would have been remembered as a single, sudden, terrifying catastrophe worth passing down as a dramatic flood story, or as a slower, less dramatic shift that communities adapted to gradually over many lifetimes. What made this hypothesis so captivating to so many people when it was first proposed wasn't simply the geology itself. It was the connection Ryan and Pittman drew between this ancient flooding event and something else entirely: the surprisingly widespread flood stories found across many different ancient cultures throughout the Near East and beyond. The most famous of these, at least to modern audiences, is the flood story found in the Bible, involving Noah and his ark. But that biblical story wasn't the earliest version of this kind of tale. Considerably older versions of a very similar flood story appear in ancient Mesopotamian literature, written down by the Sumerians and their successors long before the Hebrew Bible was written. The Sumerians, one of the very earliest complex civilizations in human history, living in what's now southern Iraq, roughly 5,000 years ago, recorded a flood story sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, describing a great flood sent by the gods that wiped out most of humanity, with only a small number of survivors managing to escape by building a boat. A similar flood story appears again in the later Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest substantial pieces of literature ever discovered, considerably predating the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years. If uncovering how these ancient stories connect to real geological events fascinates you, make sure you're subscribed, because untangling exactly which parts of ancient mythology might reflect genuine historical memory, and which parts are purely symbolic, storytelling is one of the more genuinely fascinating puzzles in archaeology today. Ryan and Pittman's original suggestion was that the Black Sea flooding event, if it really did happen suddenly and dramatically the way their hypothesis proposed, might have been remembered, passed down orally across countless generations, and eventually written down in altered form as these various Near Eastern flood stories, including the Sumerian version. It's a genuinely compelling idea, connecting a real geological event to a piece of literature that has survived in one form or another for thousands of years. It's also important to say plainly that this specific connection between the Black Sea flooding and the Sumerian flood myths specifically remains speculative rather than proven. Many other researchers point out that flood myths appear independently in cultures all over the world, in regions with no plausible connection to the Black Sea at all, suggesting that large floods, tragically common events, throughout human history in river valleys and coastal areas everywhere, may simply be exactly the kind of dramatic, memorable disaster that naturally tends to work its way into a community's storytelling traditions, regardless of whether any single specific flood inspired any single specific story. It's genuinely worth taking a moment to appreciate just how widespread flood stories are across world mythology, since this detail matters enormously for how we should weigh the Black Sea connection specifically. Flood myths appear not just in the Near East, but in cultures across nearly every inhabited continent, from ancient Chinese legends describing a great flood tamed by a legendary engineer, to Hindu texts describing a flood survived with the help of a divine fish, to numerous flood stories recorded among indigenous peoples across North America, South America, and Australia, regions with no plausible historical connection to the Black Sea whatsoever. This global pattern tells us something important. Large, devastating floods have likely occurred independently, many times, in many different parts of the world throughout human history, and it would be entirely reasonable for flood stories to emerge independently in many different cultures without needing one single shared origin event to explain all of them at once. Now, let's turn to the genetic side of this story, since this is where more recent scientific research has added a genuinely interesting new layer to the broader picture, even though it doesn't directly prove the specific Black Sea and Sumerian connection either. Ancient DNA research over the past 15 years or so has taught us a considerable amount about how farming spread from its origins in the Near East outward into Europe and other surrounding regions. Farming first developed somewhere around modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. From there, genetic evidence shows that farming spread outward through actual human migration, not simply as an idea passed between neighboring communities, but through real people moving into new territory over the following several thousand years, carrying their farming knowledge and their own genetic ancestry along with them. The region around the Black Sea sits directly along one of the plausible pathways this early farming migration would have taken as it spread from the Near East toward southeastern Europe. If a dramatic flooding event really did occur in the Black Sea basin around this same general period, it's reasonable to imagine that displaced communities living along the original lake's shoreline might have been pushed to migrate outward earlier, or more suddenly, than they otherwise would have, potentially contributing to the specific timing and pattern of farming's spread into Europe that ancient DNA research has already documented independently. This is where I want to be especially careful, because this is exactly the kind of point where a reasonable scientific possibility can accidentally get presented as more solid than it really is. Ancient DNA studies have confirmed with real confidence that farming populations did spread from the Near East into Europe during roughly this general period of history. What ancient DNA research has not yet confirmed is any specific direct genetic signature tying that migration specifically to a Black Sea flooding event, as opposed to the many other perfectly reasonable factors, population growth, land availability, and general ice age, climate change, that could just as easily explain the same general pattern of migration on their own. It's also worth being honest about a specific challenge facing any research that hopes to directly connect the Sumerians themselves to any of this. Ancient DNA research on Mesopotamia specifically, the region where the Sumerians actually lived, remains considerably more limited than research conducted in Europe. The hot, dry climate of southern Iraq, while excellent for preserving certain kinds of artifacts, tends to be considerably less kind to ancient DNA than the cooler, more stable conditions found in many European burial sites. This means researchers simply have far fewer well-preserved ancient Mesopotamian genomes available to study directly compared to the extensive genetic record now available from European sites. Until more ancient DNA can be successfully recovered and studied from Mesopotamia specifically, any direct genetic connection between the Sumerians and the earlier Black Sea region will likely remain an open question rather than a settled scientific conclusion. There's something worth appreciating here about how science actually handles a genuinely intriguing idea like this one, especially when direct proof simply isn't available yet. Rather than either dismissing the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis outright or overselling it as a definitively proven connection to the Sumerian flood story, careful researchers hold both possibilities honestly in mind at once. The geological evidence for some kind of significant flooding event in the Black Sea region is genuinely there, even if researchers still debate exactly how sudden or gradual it actually was. The similarity between the Sumerian flood story and later flood myths, including the biblical account, is also genuinely there and worth studying carefully in its own right. What remains unproven, and what may honestly remain unproven for a very long time, is the precise thread connecting these two things together into one single confirmed historical event. This kind of careful, patient uncertainty isn't a weakness in how science works. It's actually one of its greatest strengths. It would be very easy, and quite tempting, to declare a satisfying, complete connection between an ancient flood, an ancient mythology, and the origins of an entire civilization. It would make for a wonderfully tidy story, but real science, done properly, resists the temptation to declare a connection proven just because it happens to feel emotionally satisfying or narratively complete. It insists on waiting for the actual evidence, whether that evidence eventually confirms the connection, disproves it entirely, or simply leaves the question open for future researchers to keep exploring. There's a broader lesson worth sitting with here too, one that reaches beyond just this specific story about the Black Sea and the Sumerians. Ancient history is full of these tantalizing near connections, places where a genuine geological event, a genuine piece of ancient literature, and genuine genetic evidence all seem to be gesturing toward the same underlying story without quite locking together into full, undeniable proof. Learning to sit comfortably with that kind of open, honest uncertainty, appreciating a fascinating possibility fully, while still being honest about exactly how solid or how speculative it currently is, might be one of the most valuable habits anyone interested in ancient history can develop. There's a gentle way to think about this kind of open question, one that doesn't require resolving it fully to still find real value in it. Many families pass down their own stories across generations, stories about a difficult journey a grandparent once made, or a hardship a great-grandparent once survived. Over time, these stories naturally shift a little in the retelling, gaining detail here, losing detail there, sometimes taking on a slightly different shape than whatever actually happened generations ago. That doesn't make these family stories worthless or untrue in the ways that matter most. It simply means that oral memory, passed down across generations, works a little differently than a written historical record. The Sumerian flood story may work in exactly the same way, a memory of something real, reshaped and retold so many times across so many generations that connecting it back to one single precise historical event may simply no longer be fully possible. Even if the emotional and cultural truth carried inside the story remains genuinely meaningful on its own terms. So the next time you hear someone confidently declare that the Sumerian flood story proves a specific ancient flood really happened in the Black Sea, or that DNA has somehow definitively proven this connection, it's worth remembering the fuller, more careful version of this story. The Black Sea really may have flooded dramatically thousands of years ago, and ancient DNA really has taught us a great deal about how farming populations moved and spread across this same general region during roughly the same period. The Sumerians really did write down one of the oldest flood stories in human history, long before Noah's Ark ever appeared in the Bible. Whether all of these separate, genuinely fascinating threads are actually connected to one single, real historical event remains, for now, one of history's genuinely open and unresolved questions, waiting patiently for whatever future evidence might eventually help settle it one way or the other.